Test, don't guess. We all know that. We want you to test better. Valve Dynamo is a dynamometer specifically designed for MSK healthcare. It isn't a repurposed crane gauge or an inaccurate grip measure. Push, pull, grip, and more. Plus, if that wasn't enough, its app for recording and storing the data is just brilliant. valvehealth.com/dynamo for the only measurement device you'll ever need in clinic.
Welcome back to Chewing It Over with myself, Justin, and we have got a very special guest today, Ritchie Barber. Ritchie, what is the classification process and how does a physiotherapy get involved in one?
Yeah, so the classification process in parasport is all about trying to make the sport fair, in essence.
Okay.
If you imagine there are lots and lots of athletes in the Olympic Games, if you think about the Paralympic Games where you've got multiple different impairments covering multiple different disabilities, the numbers increase exponentially.
Okay.
So as a result, the level of variability in the different impairments and disabilities make it very difficult to make the races fair and even. So the classification system is basically designed to look at an athlete's impairments and how they interact with the athlete in the water to give the athlete a particular class, to make sure that the 7, 8, 9, 10 athletes that are racing together all have a fair shot at winning the race. And therefore, the only thing that really decides whether the race is run is the training history, the actual athletic ability of the athlete, and not the impairment.
100%, right. So very interesting topic to start with. I'm sure this classification system wasn't there at the very beginning of Paralympic game. Maybe could you give us a bit of a history on how it was formed?
Yeah, it's very much based around how the models of disability have evolved.
Right.
So if you think about years and years and years ago, everybody was very much focused on the medical model of disability.
Okay.
And in saying that, what I mean is people would look at somebody with a disability and go, oh, it's their brain and it's their body that are causing the disability. So what that means then is that in the early classification systems, the sport was actually very limited to only those that were in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
So it was only quite a while after that then the classification system started to evolve, and it started to reflect how disability was changing and its drive for inclusivity, to encourage everybody in. So then we started to see athletes that were ambulant, athletes with amputations, athletes with neurological conditions.
Yeah.
And in doing so, the classification system changed to one that was very much based around function. So how somebody's impairment affected their function. And that's where the ICF, the International Classification of Disability, is really important, because it gives you an indication of how somebody's impairment impacts their activity and function. So the new classification systems, or the newer classification systems that we see today, are more about how somebody's impairment affects function, whereas the older ones look at just the impairment. And they would just put athletes in the same groups with the same conditions, whereas nowadays you've got different athletes with different conditions racing together because they've got similar levels of ability.
Yeah. So like, I think before the show, I read the paper that you sent that to me. And like you said, it started off with just soldiers with spinal cord injuries. And so it's like what you say, it's more mechanical, shall we say, rather than based on function, which makes sense, really. So when did it first, or when was it first implemented?
So it was
with the framework.
So in terms of the more functional classification systems, they were more kind of introduced in the 90s.
Right. Okay.
Previous to that, we had the same disabilities in the same races.
Yeah.
But what we're actually seeing now is that even this functional classification system has its pitfalls.
Right.
Because it's a very subjective process. So let's give a very simple example.
Go on.
If you have a condition that affects your muscle power, it's likely a part of the process to give you a sport class would be to assess your muscle power.
Okay.
And the way they do that is by the manual muscle test.
Okay.
Now, we know that the Oxford scale is, yes, it's a scale with numbers, but it's still very subjective. So what we're seeing is that through real good quality evidence, we're starting to see that people are looking into ways to make the tests that govern what class an athlete gets more objective, more scientific. So
how do we do that?
Yeah, so you've got very smart minds in different universities getting together to look at things like, how do we effectively use a handheld dynamometer, for example?
Okay.
So we're not making massive changes, but we're trying to make it fairer. We're trying to make it more sensitive. We're trying to make sure that we are, or the classification system itself is as sensitive as possible to ensure that everybody has a fair shot.
That's a really good point, because it's all about inclusivity and equality. But take me a few steps back. Let's say I'm an athlete with a certain disability. Talk me through the process, like how do I get assessed? How do I get classified?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, going back to my time as an athlete and my experience, I very much was told that your mum's filled a form out to say that you've got a disability. The consultant that's looking after you has signed that form saying, yes, he has cerebral palsy. This is a official letter stating that it's true, this person has a disability, and that's called a MDF. That's called a medical disclosure form.
Okay.
So that's the first step, and that's often consultant led. And the aim of that form is to put as much subjective and objective information together so that they get through the door to start the classification process. The next step is that you would go through a two-step process. The first step is you would be in a room with a physio bed, and the physio would take you through very rudimentary tests like the manual muscle test, like range of movement tests, like coordination tests, and then you'd come out at the back of that with a certain score.
Okay.
And then the next step is you would go into your sporting environment. So if that's swimming, you'd go into a swimming pool. If that was running, you'd go onto the track. If it was cycling, you'd go onto the cycling track. And you'd complete a series of sport-specific tests that look at a combination of technique, aerobic fitness, speed and power. And then again, you would get given a score, and the two scores are then added up, and the sum of the scores gives you your sport class. So in essence, it's quite a procedural approach. And the final step is that during competition, the classifying team watch you. Okay. And this is really important because they need to see you when it really matters. And that's in a race environment. Because ultimately, having to race takes away some of the uncertainties around how much have you actually shown me that is you in those tests. Yeah. Okay. So let me, in essence, what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing stopping athletes not giving 100% of their selves in those two tests, on the bench test or on the physio bed or in that sport specific environment. So the observation in competition, gives the opportunity for the classifiers to really see the true ability of that athlete. But also, we have to remember that disabilities are variable.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the biggest things that affects my cerebral palsy is nerves. One of the biggest things that affects my cerebral palsy is fatigue.
Yeah. So
we need to see it in its truest form. So we need to see it when the athlete is racing.
These are all new to me. So thank you for shedding a light. Can you talk me through the classes? So at the end bit, of course, you've got your subjective scores, you've got your objective scores and technique. And what are the classes available, and how does that matter in sort of classifying athletes into a specific group?
Yeah, so a great question. And it's a great question because in my session on Therapy Live tomorrow afternoon, I make a clear statement that if we were to discuss all the classifications, we'd be here all night.
Right. Okay.
So
cool.
actually,
so there is a lot.
So when we take all the sports together, the number of classifications are immense. And what makes it more difficult is that the physiotherapy assessment on the bed and the sport-specific assessment in the sporting environment are very much sport-led. So they look different if you're a swimmer, they look different if you're a runner, they look different if you're a cyclist. And as a result, the classifications, the subgroups, are also different. I actually think swimming, because I'm a swimmer, is probably is probably the easiest to understand. Although there are sports that have as little as 3 classifications, like some of the boat specific sports, like rowing and kayaking.
Yeah. Cool.
But in swimming, I'll just give you an idea of swimming because I'm going to use swimming as an example.
Yeah, thanks.
Swimming is separated into, in essence, 3 subgroups. The first subgroup is the biggest, and that's the physical disabilities.
Yeah.
So the physical disabilities can be given either a 1 or a 10. So 1 is your athlete that has the most severe impairments, whereas 10 is the athlete that has the least impairment. I'll try and give you an example.
Yeah.
So an athlete that is a 10 may be a below knee amputee.
Okay.
Yeah. They may be a cerebral palsy athlete where 1 limb is affected.
Okay.
Okay. That's a
simplistic thing.
A simplistic example.
Yeah.
S1, this is where it gets super complicated. And S1 could be a significant, severe quadriplegic athlete, either cerebral palsy or spinal cord.
Yeah.
They could be a significant arthrogryposis, so where the joints in essence fuse.
Okay.
So that is the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So that is an example of a swimming classification. Now, what we tend to see, and this is a sweeping statement, I'm just trying to make it as simple as I can, is that in the middle ground, so in the 6s, the 7s, you'll often find your kind of mild to moderate cerebral palsy. So your typical hemiplegia. In the 6s, you'll often find, or in the 6s and 7s, you'll often find your short stature athletes.
Okay.
So when I say short stature, dwarfism.
Okay.
So you'll often find those in that middle ground. Towards the upper end, you will see, again, amputees.
Yeah.
So if you get an amputation above the knee, you're likely to be a 9. If you get an amputation of both legs above the knee, you're likely to be an 8. But again, this is where the complexity of the classification system kind of goes another level a little bit, because you've got classifications given to athletes with a neurological condition that are very complex, but you've also got classifications given to amputees that are really easy. It's just measuring a limb. If it's this short, then you're that class. If it's that long, then you're that class. So it's very much the spectrum of classifications challenges the classifier on many different levels, because you just don't know how complex the athlete is going to be.
Which, going back to your first point, saying that the updated or the newer forms of classification is based on function.
Yes.
Because you can have a lot of different complex issues or disability, but ultimately the function is where it's equal for most of the athletes, shall we say.
And I'll give you, that's a great way to kind of give you this example here now. So I always remember growing up, my auntie used to say to me, you're born in the water, you. And it's only really since I started working with British Paraswimming that you start to appreciate what that actually means. So you could have an athlete in a wheelchair with a significant neurological condition really struggle to function, really struggle to fit into society. But the minute you put them in the water, the environment has changed.
Yeah.
So we're looking very much at the social model of disability and how the environment has allowed them to explore their movement and explore their abilities in a way that they've never going to experience on land. So you see a different person. So anybody that's new to classification, the worst thing you can do is try and classify an athlete before you see them in the water, because the athlete on the side of the pool could be completely different to the athlete that's in the water. You know,
which is why the observers come into place.
Yeah, exactly.
I got you now. Got you now.
So, and I think that's the important point there is that's why the classification system moved to a more functional approach.
Yeah.
Because impairment, in many ways, may not drive function. You know.
Great point. Yeah, great point. Going to the main sort of topic or the content that you were going to deliver, where does physiotherapy stand in the classification? I know this might be something that you are talking a little bit more in the content, but give us a bit of a teaser. So we've talked about more like assessment side of things. Yeah. Is there any other role that physios will play?
So in essence, the physio can be part of the classification team.
Okay.
So that is very much the simplest role that the physio can play.
Okay.
Another emerging role, and I encourage anybody that has the opportunity to do this to get involved, is the research around para classification or parasport classification, and some of the universities in the Northwest are doing some really good work on this, and as is Loughborough University, MMU are doing some great work. So anybody that gets the opportunity to observe this and get involved, then I would absolutely encourage it. The bit that I'm going to try and focus on more in my talk is the bit that people don't see. So what I mean by that is that when I was a swimmer, the classification process was very much a tick box exercise. But when I swam prior to Sydney 2000, the BPA, the British Paralympic Association, received £10 million of funding.
Right.
Now, or pre-Rio, that money soared to 75 million.
Wow.
Okay. So with that comes expectation. With that comes sponsorship. With that comes pressure.
Yeah.
And you could go to bed one night a Paralympic gold medalist. you could wake up the next morning in a completely different class, looking at an uncertain future, not knowing what the hell to do. That's how powerful the classification process can be.
Yeah.
Now, I'm being dramatic. It doesn't happen overnight. But
but we get the point. Yeah.
Relatively speaking, for an athlete, it feels like that. So the talk that I'm going to give is not seeing classification as a tick box, but seeing it as a journey. And it's a journey because we've got to make sure that we help the athlete navigate the process. We help parents navigate the process, because what you've always got to remember as well is the demographics of Paralympic sport are significantly different to Olympic. The age ranges are huge. We get very young athletes. We get athletes of adult age, but still very well supported or very closely supported by parents. So we're not just supporting the athlete through it, we're supporting the parents through it. So in essence, the talk is going to kind of show a side of the classification process that physios can have a massive part to play in. And that is, how do we best support the athlete to ensure that they can navigate it with as little angst, as little anxiety or stress as possible. And the only way to do that is really to see the physio working as part of an interdisciplinary team. And that's the beauty of the talk. I think.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting one to tune into, because personally, I've not, as I told you before the recording, I've not as involved in Paralympic sport, which is definitely something physios need to be aware of, or the general public to a certain extent. Just wanted to unpick a few points. You've mentioned it's a journey. So talk us through a little bit about your journey, let's say as an athlete and now as a physio. So just these two distinctions.
Yeah, sure. So
how much has it changed, and what are your personal thoughts?
Yeah, so my journey as an athlete was pretty much ended just before the Paralympic movement received a massive big injection. And what I mean by injection, I don't mean cash, but obviously cash is one element. But London 2012 was a powerful kind of time for parasport. And even then, Beijing, it was big then as well. And I left, or I always say I'm semi-retired. I'm not semi-retired. I'm retired. I'm not coming back. But I kind of retired in 2004, just before Athens, because I didn't qualify. And that is a really kind of powerful point in my life, because I was studying to be a physiotherapist at the time. And every time I was swimming, I was thinking about studying. And every time I was studying, I was thinking about swimming. So nothing won. So I just needed to kind of make that break and decide, right, now's the time. My swimming career's done. Let's focus on being a physio.
But still stay involved in the sport. Yeah.
So one of the big kind of beliefs that I've got is having a plan. Yes, a plan can be flexible, but let's start with having one. So I had a plan. I wanted to swim for my country. I wanted to be a physio. I wanted to be a physio for my country in the sport that I love. I wanted to be a university lecturer whilst staying in touch with sport. So in many ways, I've ticked all my boxes. And when I speak to young physios and they're like, oh, I don't know what to do, I said, well, just make a plan. Have it loose. Just you don't have to stick to it. Because people often say to me, when you reflect back on your career, what are some of your kind of question marks? And I think I was asked to write a letter to myself from my 80-year-old self. And one of the points that I raised was do you think you lived your life too rigidly, in the sense that sticking to the plan, has that kind of narrowed your experiences a little bit? And I don't know, like, you know, I'm still kind of mulling over that question now. I keep thinking, if it wasn't a physio, what would it be? To be honest, I don't know. Physio's been a massive part of my life since the day I was born, you know. So I just don't feel like I could have answered that question appropriately. You know, but you know, it was one of those, that transition from being an athlete to a student to a physio was one that, had I not had lots of people around me, I wouldn't have done it. So that's another kind of massive kind of driver of mine, or real big reflection, is that you are what other people have helped you become.
Oh yeah,
you know?
100%.
So you know, I've got some massive influences in my physio career. That have really helped me out. I remember starting with British para swimming, and I referenced it in the article, that it's like kind of jumping out the frying pan into the fire, you know. So because when I started, we had some real big injuries, and without the help of the English Institute of Sport, and it would have been really tricky to navigate. So off the back of that, I have lots of gratitude for lots of different people that have helped me get where I am, you know?
Yeah. One last question from me, from a physio point of view. Like, what does a rehab program for, well, I know it sort of differs from sort of athletes/patients, but what does it look like in like in your role as a physio in Paralympic sport?
Do you know what? I think it very much starts the same, you know. So in essence, what you need to make sure you do is you ensure that you've picked the injury up. You've cleared any red flags. Okay. And then it's about a needs analysis that takes into account the physical qualities that we need to improve. All right. But also have a respect, or a level of respect, for how the impairments interact. So for me, a rehab program is one that isn't afraid to see the impairments as an opportunity to even attempt to improve those. You know, the old school thought around Paralympics was work on strengths because you can't improve the weaknesses, but that's not necessarily true. You know, there are elements that you can have an impact on. So I think from my point of view, it's about kind of not being afraid to have a go at those in that injured time. But also, I think a rehab program with a Paralympic athlete requires you to have an open mind. And what I mean by that is, it's a lot more trial and error, because when you look at an able-bodied athlete's shoulder, you'd expect it to behave in a way to a given stimulus or to a given stress. But when you impart that expectation on a Paralympic shoulder, it doesn't respond or react in the same way. So you've got to have an open mind around understanding what you see and being patient with that, if that makes sense.
100%.
You know, and then finally, it's about exploration. Like, one of the biggest ways that I've learned is just playing. You know, playing with the strength and conditioning coach around what exercises, how can we manipulate and adapt this exercise, how can we manipulate and adapt this exercise. So learning through play, you know, and learning through exploring with the athlete in time, So people think you've got to treat an athlete and you've got to be spot on with the exercise and you've got to be able to show it nice and you've got to be able to demonstrate it and you've got to do this number of sets and this number of reps and this weight. But sometimes with a Paralympic athlete, it's, I'm not sure this is going to work, but let's try it together.
Yeah.
Let's learn from each other, In actual fact, I'm just, I'm writing a session for the students at university at the minute that talks about exercise prescription for pain relative to your physical qualities. So if somebody's not in as much pain, then maybe you can afford a bit more specificity. Maybe you can afford a bit more focus on rep, sets, load, and what have you. But if you're dealing with somebody that's got a little bit more focus around pain, then maybe they're, there's strong suggestion that they're not as important, And in many ways, in those early phases of getting a Paralympic athlete right, that model sometimes works.
Yeah. And I would argue that is not only confined to Paralympic athletes. Normal sort of like a human being, it's also applicable as well. Like these are the principles that I've listened, that I feel like, oh, actually, I can apply this to my NHS outpatient patients or just a simple athlete. So that's really, really informing. Richie, how can people... Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I think people are often a little bit nervous about working with Paralympic athletes because they just don't know what to expect. And I think for me, it's one of those situations where sometimes you just got to dive in and just experience it,
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure it's a good experience for students or practitioners that are new to this area of field. From the paper that you've sent me, when I've had a read through, it also seems like the population is getting bigger and bigger. So I do see this as a good opportunity for the role of physio to be bigger and bigger as well.
Yeah, and it's a great point to finish on because when I've done a similar talks and presentations like this to other people, I've said, don't sit back in your chair thinking that this is not something that you will experience, because it will be. If you want to go and work in Olympic sport, program that you go into might be a sport that has a mixed program. Able-bodied and disabled athletes training together. And therefore, when they train together, they sometimes share staff, physio, doctor, whatever. So in actual fact, classification, if you're going to get involved in sport, is likely to be landing on your desk quicker than you think. So
being prepared and being aware is more important. Richie, where can people find out a little bit more about you?
So I am fairly active on Twitter. My handle is Ritchie Swim, RITCHIESWIM. I am also on LinkedIn, but to be honest, you just better search in my name in LinkedIn because the handle for LinkedIn is too long. I can never remember it.
Fair enough.
One thing I have remembered to do is I put all my contact details at the bottom of each slide. So you'll be able to, every slide that turns over, it will be on there. So that's where they can find me. Equally, search the University of Salford staff directory. I will be there. Anybody that is keen to know more or keen to kind of understand the role of physio within classification in different settings, feel free to give me a shout. I am super keen to share as much knowledge that I have of Paralympic sports as possible, really.
Nice one. And I definitely say for myself that we are very excited and to a certain degree very honored to have you to share your side of your story and also your experience to the Physio Matters platform. And I'm pretty sure, I'm very certain that your talk is going to be amazing at Therapy Live. By this time, when the podcast is released, I'm pretty sure the talk or the event will be over. So definitely get your recordings with the links that are attached with this podcast or video. We'll also include some of the information that you've sent to us prior. So if that's okay with you, Ritchie.
Yeah, sure.
So there is a paper and also a link to on the CSP website, and I highly encourage people that are interested into having a read, because prior to reading and prior to this podcast, I had almost zero knowledge. And after reading a little bit more and after having a really fruitful conversation with you, Ritchie, I feel like there's a next level of understanding to what athletes have to go through, and a physio now. So thank you very much for that.
Here at Physio Matters, we think physio matters. Join as a premium member now and access over 500 videos, get free tickets to shows and upgrades included. Access at home, work or on a unicycle to take your knowledge to the moon. Physio-matters.com, more content than you can fit into a gym.